Hello and welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. Fiona here. This week's podcast was originally broadcast on the TNT Show on Independence Live's YouTube channel. It is John Drummond interviewing Stephen Flynn for about 20 minutes, followed by John and Mike Small from Caledonia discussing the conversation and various other things. It's really quite an interesting episode. Hope you enjoy it.
Hello and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond. We have Stephen Flynn, leader of the SNP group at Westminster. Hi Stephen, how are you?
I'm good, John. How are you doing?
Well, I'm looking forward to it. We interviewed your predecessor, Ian Blackford, I think when we first started the programme about 3 years ago. And that was great fun. I think at that time he was in Portcullis House. Is that where you are now?
It is. It's where I'm sat just now, yeah.
Yeah, I remember it well. Now, we don't have a lot of time, and I'm greatly appreciative of the time that you do have with us, Stephen. So I want to cut right to the chase, if you don't mind. And I'd like to put to you, if I may, some questions that people have sent to us in advance. One question comes up time and time again on this programme, increasingly, is about sovereignty. People are troubled about where sovereignty lies. And the two favourite feelings about sovereignty, I think it'd be fair to say, are the Scots are sovereign. But at the same time, in an interesting way, Westminster is also sovereign. And the question that people are confused over is how can you have two sovereign entities?
No, I think that's fair. It's something which gets said to me a fair bit as well when I'm travelling around the country, speaking to lots of different branches and members and yes, activists in general. Look, as a point of fact, it's the UK Parliament which is sovereign on these isles. I don't think anyone can realistically argue with that. Where we differ in our views is that we obviously believe that sovereignty should ultimately lie with the people of Scotland, and that's what we want to seek to achieve, that they have that final decision making over all aspects of their life in a way that they don't at this moment in time. It's for this place to determine so many things that impact upon us, whether that's how we deal with the cost of living crisis or the economy or trade or migration or indeed foreign affairs, all of which are pretty hotly debated topics at the moment. But the one that's most important to probably all of us is supporters of Scottish independence, which is the Constitution. And, the Supreme Court was pretty clear that responsibility for that rests down here. And, that's a major frustration for all of us, because it's obviously curtailing our ability to ensure that the people of Scotland have that democratic say over their own future.
Thanks for that. It doesn't quite resolve the question, though, because the reality is that, do you believe, let me ask you the question direct, do you believe that the Scottish people are sovereign?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I believe the Scottish people should be sovereign and are sovereign, but unfortunately, because of...
With accepting rule from Westminster?
Yeah, because of the nature of the union that we have, ultimately, Parliament is sovereign on these isles. So as much as I want something to be the case, and I believe something should be the case in terms of the people of Scotland being able to determine all aspects of their life, it's a point of fact. The UK Parliament is a sovereign entity, and that's to my great frustration. And of course, as I said earlier, it's curtailing our ability to do the things that we want to do across a whole host of policy areas, and ultimately ensure that people of Scotland can decide their own future.
Some people have said that Scots sovereignty is a moral position, and Westminster sovereignty is the legal position. Would you agree with that?
You're probably delving me into territory here, which is somewhat legalistic in its outlook. But yeah, I guess as a point of principle, we're probably not that far away from agreement in relation to that. And that's the reality of the situation on these isles, and hopefully we can be in a point soon where we can change that.
So it would be a journey then, if that were the case, from the moral case to the legal case, i.e. that the moral case is already established. Scots are sovereign. In order to give that effect, one needs to persuade Westminster to accept that moral case.
No, I would probably simplify that down, that it's not necessarily a case of convincing Westminster. I think it's probably a case of convincing the majority of the Scottish people to vote for it, to vote for Scotland to be an independent democratic nation, and to put that sovereignty back into their hands. And I guess that's why the general election is going to be so important this year. And we need to make sure that we have a very clear understanding of the fact that, whether that's Scottish National Party MPs or otherwise, where they're going to be the ones who are arguing that case for Scotland to have control over its own future. And that's in stark contrast, of course, to the Labour Party, the Tories and the Lib Dems.
Yeah, the government is saying as recently as today that in the case of Northern Ireland, while there may well be a case to be made, presumably they've dropped the word moral, but a case to be made for reunification, nonetheless, the time is not right. Now is not the time.
And now is not the time. There was a former Prime Minister, I think it was Theresa May, who coined that phrase, wasn't it? Look, the situation...
It's a good argument, because what it says is I'm not saying no, because by saying no, it would produce a constitutional crisis.
Yeah,
and
I think...
avoided that by saying not now.
Yeah, there was an interesting intervention. I think it was John Major last year. Was it last year? I think it was last year, who wrote that the UK government should effectively be outlining the circumstances under which they would allow and would permit a border poll in Northern Ireland. But that's a matter for the Northern Irish people. It's for people who live there to determine what happens with their constitutional future and the journey that they're on. I'm very much focused on the constitutional journey we're on and the future we want to see, which of course is that independent nation.
I'd like your view on this. A lot of people have argued that, in complete agreement with what you've just said, they say, hey, we need to, I think the expression is, hold Westminster's feet to the fire a little bit here and be assertive. And one of the best ways of doing that, perhaps, and I think this possibly SNP policy, is to put together a constitutional convention like happened in the case of devolution. An old friend of mine helped to put that together, Canon Kenyon Wright, and it was hugely successful. Not everyone participated. The SNP didn't, and I can't remember if the Tories participated fully. But nonetheless, it had enormous impact because it wasn't just a party or a series of parties speaking. It was the Scottish people speaking. And that's very hard to deny. Would you agree?
Yeah, and particularly when you're bringing together the political world and the civic world in Scottish daily life. And I think there's a huge power that lies underneath that, and you're right to touch upon it. You're also right to touch upon the fact that it is obviously something which was agreed by the party at its conference, and I'm hopeful that we can get to a point where we can bring that together. Of course, one of the big barriers to that happening in probably the coming months is a general election. I can't imagine there's going to be many partners who are going to want to delve into that in advance of the public going to the polls. But the inescapable reality of where we are at the moment, irrespective of the polls in relation to the SNP or otherwise, is that the independence figures remain pretty solid. Roughly 50% of our fellow Scots want independence. And that's before we start a positive campaign to bring others onto our side as well. So it's not going away. It's not going to go away now. It's not going to go away whether there's a Labour government, be that majority or minority. And it's for politicians in London to accept and to understand that. But the thing that we can do whilst they are dithering is to try and galvanise that support, to bring together that wider civic society in Scotland, to have that national conversation about how we ensure that Scotland's democracy is respected and what powers we believe should be transferred to Scottish Parliament in the interim, but ultimately how we make sure that ultimate power over our own future is transferred as soon as possible as well.
Isn't it an argument, though, taking your point about an upcoming election, that the independence position, generally speaking, would be strengthened prior to election if the Scottish people were told categorically there will be a constitutional convention. These are the groups who will be represented. And when you vote in November, whenever the Prime Minister, whoever that happens to be at that time, decides it's appropriate, then people will know that one of the outcomes of that election is the very thing that you've said is desirable, i.e. there will be a constitutional convention. It's not a debate, it's not a discussion, this will take place. And this is the timing of that. In other words, whatever the outcome is, and you would expect the SNP support to perhaps be a little bit greater than it is just now, because even though the figures for independence have remained fairly solid over the years, the SNP support, according to opinion polls, has not. And that might be a way of engendering a warmer feeling amongst the electorate, dare I say, if you were able to say, this is what's going to happen, categorically, no question about it.
So I don't disagree with the premise of what you're saying. What I would maybe do is be a little bit of a devil's advocate in terms of the practicalities of that, because of course only way to bring a constitutional convention together is to have willing participants, and it's probably going to be a little bit challenging for some people to agree to sign up to something in advance of an election and say it's definitely happening. But as a point of principle, in terms of what we want to see achieved, the party has been clear in that regard. And the sooner we can do that, the better. But we do need all partners to come together: those who believe in independence and those who don't, and those from right across all aspects of Scottish society to come forward to chart that path forward. Because we need the logjam to be broken, and we can't. We can't continue to sit with 50% of the people of Scotland believing in something, and then obviously the politicians in Westminster turned in a blind eye to that because of the basis of where power rests in these isles.
Exactly. Another question that's cropped up, and you're the perfect man to answer this.
Well, that sounds worrying.
is people have said, look, isn't there a danger if the whole SNP group is at Westminster all of the time, that serves to legitimise the Westminster concept of sovereignty and erode the moral Scottish case? In other words, you seem to be participating in the very system that you want to not participate in. And it looks like a sort of non sequitur to some people.
And again, that's a question which has been posed to me on a number of occasions, and it's usually probably worded slightly different, which is why don't you just abstain from Parliament?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying
No. But that's what
I'm just wondering why the whole group needs to be there.
Yeah. Well, of course, we're not always here all the time. Most of my colleagues, I think, are probably elsewhere at any given moment during the week. And, I've seen on social media, most of them have been out chapping doors quite a lot in recent weeks, which is the right way to try and win an election. Look, our role down here is pretty simple. In my eyes, our role is to stand up for Scotland and to advance the cause of Scottish independence whilst doing so. If we're not here, if we're not making the most of the platform that we have, then those green benches just fill up with other people who will move along from the Labour benches or move down from the Lib Dem benches or so on and so forth, and use the speaking time that we have to put forward their arguments and their cases. So I want to make sure that we make the most of the platform that we've been given by the Scottish people. And I will never, whilst we're under the auspices of Westminster, whilst we still send MPs here, I will never leave the Scottish people without a voice in Westminster. And that's a very important point, because we can be Scotland's voice here, and we are Scotland's voice. And we need to make sure.
I mean, that's I don't think anyone is seriously suggesting that. They're not suggesting, hey, all the MPs should come home. But there might be
some people do.
Well, I'm sure they do. I mean, but I would like to think that was not necessarily a majority opinion. But who knows? The reality is that there is a real danger in being part of the very system that you hope to not be a part of. And I just wondered why. I mean, it seems to me that given that the benches would fill up with Labour MPs, I can quite understand that. But I just wondered if it's possible to have the same voice, because you're very good. I mean, there's no question. I speak to people who are not independent supporters, but they're Stephen Flynn supporters.
That's quite nice.
And they will never vote for independence, whatever happens. But they do support you. And the reason they support you is because of eloquence, and it's because of conviction. And it's also because, frankly, you have an imposing presence on the floor. That's terribly important, and I wouldn't seek in any way, shape or form to understate that. But I just wondered if there's some mechanism that says we are going to retain that, but we are going to also create a presence in Scotland around our MSP and MP base, perhaps to put forward a constitutional convention which would promote a constitution for an independent Scotland. And that would be something that people would focus on persistently and consistently, so that the Scottish people could see that the SNP group were being very assertive because I think there's a danger right now, if I may say so, that the group is seen to be non-assertive, despite your performance on the floor.
So I would probably challenge that a wee bit, just gently push back, because, see, when I look at the work that my colleagues are doing down here, and it's far more than just me asking a couple of questions on a Wednesday afternoon. When I look at the finance bill yesterday, which basically is the government's mechanism for putting through its budget, it was Drew Henry who was speaking the loudest and the most assertive in relation to the cost of living crisis and the support that should be there. If we go back just a couple of weeks to the post office scandal in Westminster finally waking up to that, it was Marion Fellows, obviously my colleague from Motherwell, who was at the forefront of the debate in and around that, because Marion's been working on that for years under the radar to make sure that justice was found for those people. When we go a little bit further back, when we go back to when Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament, it was my colleague Joanna Cherry who, of course, showed that to be unlawful and ensured that Parliament was sitting again. And I could go through probably every single one of my colleagues, Alison Thewlis, when it comes to the two-child cap and the rape clause, who of course has brought that to public consciousness in a way that it wasn't previously. And, I could go one by one and say all these things that have made a difference, not just to their constituents, but to people right across Scotland. And that's us using the platform that we have here in Westminster to be that voice for Scotland, now incrementally working on all those things. And, not all of them end up with flashing lights on the 6 o'clock news, but it still is important. And if we weren't the ones doing it, then I dare say nobody would be doing it. And, that circles us back to the situation in Gaza and the fact it was SNP MPs. Of course, the motion was or the amendment was in my name, but it was all of my colleagues united who were able to do that and use our position as third party in Westminster to gain the time in the House of Commons to ensure that MPs had a vote on whether there should be a ceasefire or not. And, when we get the opportunity in a few weeks, hopefully through an opposition day debate, to do the same, it will be the SNP who use their time to really drive home what the values are of people in Scotland. And that's our role. Our role is to stand up for Scotland, be that voice. And in doing so, I genuinely believe that we advance the cause of Scottish independence incrementally. And in the same way that Alec did all those years ago when he came to prominence by interrupting a budget back, I think, before there was even TV cameras. He used this place to advance his cause and the cause of Scottish independence. And, we're doing the same now through every single action that we take when we're here. And, when my colleagues aren't here, myself included, we're making sure that we are speaking with businesses and with people on the streets right across Scotland. And we do that. Our staff teams are always working every single day to support people right across constituencies as well. I know my own office deals with thousands upon thousands of emails every year, as everyone does. And, we can make that difference, and we can ultimately, when we're doing that, advance the cause that we also dearly believe in. And at some point, hopefully, we will get to the point where we no longer need to send MPs down here. And I tell you what, I'll be the happiest man going when that's the case, because Scottish MPs should not be something which Westminster entertains for the future. Our Parliament's in Holyrood, and that's where our future lies.
It's very laudable, and I agree with everything you said. I was simply making the point that despite all of that hard work, there's a general view that the SNP generally needs to be much more assertive in setting the agenda. The impression that lots of people get, rightly or wrongly, is that the SNP reacts, i.e. the government plans to do something and the SNP responds and replies. There's not too much of the other part going on where the SNP is saying, look, this is what we're doing. This is why I mentioned the Constitutional Convention so often. Yeah. This is what we're doing. This is going to be a fact. This is going to happen. And what you're doing is you're pushing the envelope as opposed to reacting to what someone else has said.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, we're always, I'm always happy to speak with folk about what we could be doing differently or better. And on the Constitutional Convention side of things, I think we're broadly speaking in the same place, and hopefully at some point in the not too distant future we can get to a point where we can bring together that wider civic society in Scotland to debate where we go. And I think that would be of benefit to all of us, not just those who believe in independence, but for those who don't as well, because ultimately Scotland belongs to all of us. It's all of our country.
Exactly.
And we need to make sure that everyone is involved now and in the future to make Scotland the place it can ultimately be.
Absolutely. And by the way, who is responsible for setting up the convention? Who is doing that inside?
You're testing me there. Let me come back to you on that one, John.
Well, I mention it because people find it hugely interesting. That's why I mention it. It's not a sort of passing circumstance. The people do say to me all the time, so when is it going to happen? Who's doing it? What's happening? And for me, I've said it before, but it seems to be a vote winner. And anything that gets extra votes going up to the next is good. Has to be a good thing. That's all I'm suggesting to you. But yes, if you could come back to us. And also, I know we're encroaching vastly into your time here, but it would be lovely to have longer to talk about some of these issues and perhaps a few others that I'm sure you would like to talk about. I mean, I've done most of the questioning, but it would be great if we got more time sometime, perhaps later in the future, maybe later in the month or next month when things are a bit easier for you.
Yeah, the one challenge I face in life, which is graver than having to fit my time in with my kids, is trying to fit in time for everything else. So yeah, I'm sure we can get something sorted in the not too distant future.
And if you can come back to us with the details on the Constitutional Convention, that would be fantastic. Because we'll be happy to publicise it here.
We can see if anything's been followed up on the back of the motion that was agreed at conference. But as I would say, I imagine much of that's probably been superseded by the fact that we'll be in a general election campaign, or we are in a general election campaign right now, aren't we? So we'll take it.
I hope not, because we both agree it's terribly important to reach out to that bunch of folks who are not political. And if you ask them any political questions, they look at you with that strange expression that says, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Indeed.
I'm conscious of the fact that your team has said to us, look, Stephen only has this limited amount of time.
I think I'm a wee bit over, but it's been a real pleasure to be on. Keep up the good work, and all the best for the future.
Thanks, Stephen. Look forward to the next time. Take care.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye now.
Well, that's great. And now we'll be joined by Mike Small of Bella Caledonia. A big thank you to Stephen Flynn for finding the time to talk to us in a very busy schedule. As he says, he has to fit in all these family requirements. He has to fit in party requirements, all the speaking engagements, all the emails, all the rest of it. That perhaps explains why I'm not a politician. What about you, Mike? Would you like the political life like that?
I don't think so. No, not for me.
We were talking earlier, and thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. Earlier about some of the issues that are current in Scotland. And I was talking to Stephen there about the Constitutional Convention, because it seems he's agreeing it's very important. You would like to think there's going to be some movement along these lines, perhaps to see it being realised. As you look at the Scottish scene today through the eyes of Bella Caledonia, what do you see as the big issues?
I think the cost of living crisis is in everybody's experience. And I saw Humza Yousaf being interviewed yesterday by Alistair Campbell, and he brought this up as the kind of dominant issue of the day. People are living with horrendous choices about heating or eating, people falling into poverty, people already in poverty falling into destitution. And this is the direct result of the management of the economy by the British government. And I think that's the dominant issue of the day. I think that for people's lived experience, but I think also the ongoing atrocities in Gaza are also a kind of stain on our existence at the moment, and a direct result of the British state and the arms industry.
It's interesting. I was reading a book on Alexander Hamilton earlier, and he drew a sharp distinction. I think now we call it realpolitik, that states behave not on their sympathies but on their interests. I mean, it's a trial, frankly, for people outside the political setup to understand that states have a particular mindset, which is very hard for them to shift. And it makes people looking from the outside perplexed. They see moral situations and they do not understand why states don't behave morally. I think that's the issue.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there's vested economic interests in the arms trade, but there's also geopolitical pressures at play here with connections between the British government and players within it and Israel, and then, of course, with America, which is the main supporter of Israel and the main supporter of the atrocities that we see unfolding on our timelines. And I think one of the things that we're witnessing is the first kind of live streamed genocide. It's an appalling thing to witness. And I think it's quite damaging for people's mental health to feel this powerless in the face of such atrocities.
Some people, I say some people, by no means a majority, say things like, this is the Nazis' final reward, as it were, is that they've turned people into behaving a bit like themselves. Would you go that far?
I think it's really important to honour the Jewish Holocaust and to fight back against anti-Semitism, but there is clearly a dark irony in the situation in Gaza, resembling the Warsaw Ghetto, and down the time that shift of power happening and trauma being transferred to a different generation. But I would always want to stand out against anti-Semitism as well as call out the atrocities of the Israeli state.
Yeah, I think it's important to draw that distinction. And thank you for helping us do that. The question that came up that I put to Stephen, I would like to put to you, if I may, which is a lot of people say to me that the SNP are just not assertive enough. They say that you can't really expect the existing state to comply. You have to persuade the existing state to concede. And while there is a moral argument that we discussed, and I take it you would accept that moral argument that the Scots are sovereign, but for practical purposes, Westminster remains. The state sovereignty is vested there. And therefore, the question is, how do you put the moral case? And it's hard to say how you can do that without being assertive. Would you agree?
I would, but I think I might frame it slightly differently in that the SNP are a mainstream party, political party, which are in government in Holyrood and participate in Westminster. So it's almost like asking an entity that isn't, to do something that it isn't. It's a mainstream political party operating within mainstream party politics with mainstream policies. It's not an insurgent movement. So the movement asking it to be something it isn't really going to work. Yes, in theory, it could behave differently, but it's not going to. It hasn't shown any sign that it is going to. And keeping asking it to do that, I think, misunderstands the nature of the beast. I think you're right, though, in the wider sense that Scottish independence is about rupture. It is about dismantling the British state. It is about succession. And the narrative that we're told all the time is from the mainstream of the party is nothing will really change. You don't need to be frightened about anything. Everything's kind of going to be the same. It won't really be much bother. Don't frighten the horses, and so on. Nothing's going to change about the economy. You're not going to have to face any difficulties. It's all going to be very smooth and it'll all be fine. Now, that's clearly nonsense. It's utter nonsense. We're talking about dismantling the British state. We're talking about a huge change, rupture. And as we face the challenges that we face about our society and about our environment and about climate, we as a society have to make massive changes. And Scottish independence is located within that wider reality of society. So I don't know if that answers your question, but on the one hand, we have politicians telling us it's all going to be fine, it's all going to be very smooth, don't worry about anything. And the rest of us are looking at the world going, how can that possibly be true?
I think you've hit you've gone straight to the nub of it, it seems to me. That there's a huge confusion out there. I just don't think it works to say to people, bide your time, take a deep breath, in due course, things will get better, because we have a magic bullet here called independence. And your standard of living is going to improve dramatically once we fire that magic bullet. But it ain't going to happen right now because we don't have our finger on the trigger. Some other guy does. And you think, well, what's the point of the bullet then if you can't fire it? And that's where people I'm sorry, I have all these mixed metaphors. I do apologize. But nonetheless, I think I'm slightly trying to articulate the confusion in people's minds. They have a problem right now. I can't feed the kids. I can't pay my rent. The landlord has just put up my expenses yet again. Council, all the rest of it, it just goes on and on. They go to the supermarket and they say, I have a real problem. And I'm looking to you guys who claim that you want to represent me to fix it. Now fix it.
And I think, Stephen Flynn's a politician that I have some admiration for, but I think it was quite telling in your interview with him. You were saying, what about Constitutional Convention? There was a motion passed at your party conference. When's that happening? And he was kind of like, to all intents and purposes, he told you it's not going to happen.
Exactly.
It's not going to happen because there's a general election coming up. And all the political parties want to knock shade out of each other in the battle to win seats. So their only raison d'etre this year is to get elected, to get into Westminster, to get re-elected. And it's a kind of game without real victory. You know, we got into this narrative, which is get the Tories out. Who's going to get the Tories out? Vote Labour, vote SNP, get the Tories out. And of course you want the Tories out, but it's a very narrowing agenda where everything gets reduced to get the Tories out.
Yeah.
Because we've been here before. We've been here before many times. You get Labour in, and then they disappoint. This time they've disappointed in advance. All of our disillusionment has happened 6 months before they get elected, rather than 6 months after they get elected.
Yeah.
But it is a very reductive political game that the only purpose is to get the Tories out. For what? To what intents and purpose?
Yeah.
What is the actual goal and vision and aspiration of these parties? It seems very unclear to me.
And it seemed to me that a constitutional convention was a way of putting cloth on that aspiration, because you have to make it real. The longer you talk about aspirations, the more people switch off, because what they're saying is you should be doing something concrete. And I invited Stephen to talk about a concrete thing and to see it as a benefit, not a handicap. Yeah. But in fact, and this seems to be true about the whole of the SNP, and I apologise if I misconstrued this, but my sense of it is they would rather not deal with the Constitution, even though they want to change it. It's a nuisance. It's something to be dealt with at some other time, in some other place. And the Constitutional Convention would have fixed that problem right away. And instead of seeing it as a problem, to see it as a real asset, to go into election saying, this is what we're going to do right away. You're going to have a voice, not just every general election and not just every Scottish election, but all of the time. You know, now the counter-argument, I can hear it now, is, well, you've got MSPs, you've got MPs. It's not enough. It's not enough. It was enough. I think that time is gone. I think people are looking for something very different.
Yeah, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because the people that will deliver it are professional politicians in mainstream political parties, and it's not in their interests to deliver it, because delivering it would cede power or share power down to ordinary people, and that's not in their interests. It may happen if people want to set up a entirely civic-based convention or assembly. Or assemblies, and that might be a road for the movement to go down, but it's not going to be delivered by political parties, in my opinion.
In that case, the political parties then effectively they're reducing themselves by avoidance, because all that happens is that people say, well, this guy next door who set up the assembly actually is his finger on the pulse in a far better way than you guys are managing, and so therefore, if he ever stood for election, I'd vote for him. You know, it seems to be it's reductive. It takes the parties into a place where they shouldn't really want to go, to be seen as less and less relevant. I think particularly at these troubled times, you need to be seen to be more relevant.
Yeah.
You need to be very assertive. You can't afford to go into an election where people are starving and can't afford a roof over their head saying, well, we'll tweak this and we'll tweak that, and I shall make a speech. You think, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, there is the point. There is the point where you get social breakdown and ecological breakdown, and nothing changes, and nobody offers alternatives. And I think we're nearing that point where people's faith in political systems is eroded and undermined by inaction and complicity. And I think we're very near that point. And I think it's interesting, and I think that's true in lots of Western society, but it's got a particular aspect in Britain where there's also the constitutional question laid over that reality, where people feel very frustrated and very disappointed and don't see directly where there are alternatives. Yeah,
and that leads to an increase in populism, where people suddenly appear on your television screen saying, like they did over Brexit, I've got the magic bullet here. I've got a button here, right? If I can mix my metaphors again. And if I press that, you're going to have a job. In fact, you're going to get paid more. And I'll tell you something, where I'm going to find the money is because of all these immigrants. Yeah. And I'm going to bear down on them. And from them, I'm going to get all this money and I'm going to give it to you. Bingo.
That's right. 40 new hospitals, stop the boats. Yeah. We saw the Prime Minister of this country taking a bet yesterday for £1,000 on television. I mean, just really depraved behaviour that in previous times might have led to resignation or shame. But that's Britain in 2024. That's the British state that we're still attached to.
That was the underlying point I was trying to make during the earlier interview. Mm-hmm. That when people feel that there's no moral anchor, it's vastly in your interest to provide one. Mm-hmm. And I would rather than shun morality, which is what most politicians are prone to do, is to embrace it and say, the fact that you're starving and your kids don't get fed, that's morally wrong. Yeah. That's not a political problem, it's a moral problem.
Yeah. And I think I'm very critical of the SNP, but I think to their credit, both Stephen Flynn and Humza Yousaf and others have been very good at calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, denouncing the actions of the Israeli state, and in stark contrast to the British government and indeed to the Labour Party. So I think that is to their credit, because this is a moral question that we're all presented with at the moment. And I think that's an example where they have stepped up. In many other issues, I think they have failed. But I think in that respect, they have spoken out very clearly.
Yeah, I agree. They deserve enormous credit because there must have been many voices saying, look, don't say anything. Yeah, it'll be far better for you in the long term. You need to ingratiate yourself with a portion of the electorate who will find this unpalatable. They've stepped up to the plate. They've knocked it out of the park. What troubles me is they don't take the next step, which is to say, as a result of that moral imperative, we plan to do the following. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's missing so much of the time. And listening to Stephen, he spoke with enormous feeling, and rightly, in my view, about the fantastic work that the group of MPs are doing there. Yeah. And I didn't feel I got an answer to the question as, why does everyone have to be there, apart from the notion that somehow the green benches that they left behind would be occupied by Labour? Well, I think most people in Scotland would say, so what? I'd rather you were back here making concrete steps to reduce, to somehow find money for people who desperately need to clothe and feed their kids.
Yeah, I mean,
there's
clearly,
so many symbolic things.
Yeah, clearly in his response, he sees the active work of the SNP in calling the British government to account and questioning legislation as it passes through Parliament. And there is an argument for that. Until you get to a state where you've got an alternative strategy, that's what they're going to do. And I think if the SNP are to be questioned, it's for two things. One is for failure of policy in Holyrood, which we can talk about or people can challenge. And the other, I think, is a failure of strategy. What is the strategy for winning independence? Exactly. What is the purpose of MPs going to Westminster. What are they doing there, and what is their plan? And it does seem, I think, a little bit hazy.
Yeah.
But unless there's a time where there's an alternative strategy that's really clear, i.e. we are not going to take our seats because we've got something else to do, and this is our constitutional strategy, they are going to do what they currently do, which is question legislation.
Yeah, and for a lot of people that seems like half the job. Mm-hmm. They want to see them doing the other half of the job. They do, and I said to Stephen, and I stick by this, they do a great job with that part of the job, holding the government to account. Mm-hmm. What's missing is the other bit that says, I'm going to require the government to do the following, and they have to tell the world why it's not going to happen. Then that does occur from time to time.
Yeah.
But it's not part of anything cohesive. I think that's the point.
Yeah.
And I think people need that, and they want that. And they're just not getting it. And I think what that does is it leaves a vacuum, mm-hmm. and then it gets filled by all sorts of stuff, extraneous stuff, mm-hmm. Because people don't see that assertion. I keep using the word, but it seems to me it's important, mm-hmm. Because people respond to assertive politicians, good or bad. You know, I'm not saying anything that's terribly innovative and creative here. Anyone who's looked at, dare I say it, the likes of Farage and others, they've got nothing behind them, but, mm-hmm. but they sound as if they do. And I think you have to, if you can take a proselytizing approach coupled with real achievements, then you've got the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we can see the rise of the far right and of the populist right in America and in Britain is extraordinary. And people in desperate times, if you tell people very simple, even simplistic, crude solutions, which other people blame, people, often people from abroad. I mean, we're in an extraordinary position, which where we had Priti Patel as our Home Secretary, and we have Home Secretaries and domestic policy, which is essentially what the National Front in 1974 would be advocating as mainstream British government policy. It is extraordinary. And we also see the Labour Party, the incoming Labour government, as it is, completely capitulating to this agenda of stop the boats, blaming immigrants. And it's terrifying times to live in.
Why do you think that has happened? Why does the Labour Party take this supine approach to politics? It surely can't just be grubbing for votes, surely. Yeah,
I think you'll be aware of that idea of the Overton window, the kind of the frame of what's politically acceptable in society. The Overton window has shifted to the right over years, and I think particularly. You're not really allowed to talk about English politics or English culture, but I think we need to. I think English political culture is such that it's been captured by an agenda and a set of influencers and think tanks and media which dominate the public realm, the public narrative. And the Labour Party have to operate within that Overton window that is quite far to the right. We saw with Jeremy Corbyn, and we see previously when the Labour Party moved to the left, their leadership would be savagely attacked by the right-wing press, denounced, rubbished, smeared. And not only that, but people within the Labour Party did it to their own leader and destroyed his candidacy. So I think Starmer is operating within that framework of what's acceptable to say in English political culture.
I think it is very sad. I mean, we spoke to Elliot Bulmer last week, and his big concern, and it's been voiced by others, various professors and philosophers we've interviewed from the South, who've said that the English people can't speak. There is no voice. There is no forum, because the British Parliament is seen to be the English Parliament. And what that does is it neuters the ability for people in England to have the conversation of the kind that you and I have been having about what's best, what values, what morals. I mean, you never hear that discussion. There's nobody in England says, look, guys, we need to talk about ourselves. I mean, forget the Celtic fringe for a second. You and I need to have a conversation about what sort of England we want to see going forward. Where is the place for that to take place? There is no place.
I think it's true that Britain is overlaid on top of England, as Tom Nairn would have had it in the past. I think there are some voices on the left who are concerned with this, but it's very peripheral, and even notions about devolution within England are currently reduced to sort of, let's have a mayor, and that's often the way they discuss devolution, as if that's the same thing, which it clearly isn't. So it is a real problem. England being able to talk to and about itself and its own direction is a real problem. Yeah, and being subsumed into a culture which doesn't actually achieve very much in that regard. I mean, I know to Scots ears it may sound very odd to say that England doesn't have a voice when they watch Westminster and they hear politicians saying this is what we want to achieve in the NHS in England. But nonetheless, that's not the same thing. It's not the same thing as somebody asking you, how do you see your future? Yeah.
Because that's a powerful question, because it liberates you as the responder to express what you feel is important to you. And Scotland's had that conversation now for decades.
For 100 years or more, yeah. And I think not being able to identify yourself is a problem. I think if you look recently at the Brexit debacle, there was a lot of talk of Britannia Unchained, and that was a book written by the right of the Tory party. And this is kind of British nationalism. This is triumphalism. It's also deeply deluded. And while that narrative dominates, it's very difficult for ordinary English people to begin to have a honest conversation about the problems we have in our society and how you might improve them, because you're kind of getting high on this notion of Britain Unchained and a global Britain and all this while people are facing poverty and destitution like we haven't seen for decades. So it's a real crisis.
Yeah, I saw a stat once that said that most people in the UK could identify a Spitfire from its silhouette, but no one in Germany could identify a Messerschmitt. And that spoke to a cultural choice about applauding things that have gone, not looking to the future.
That's right. I mean, it's a culture absolutely saturated in nostalgia, and it has been called, I've heard it called Spitfire nationalism, where England in particular is obsessed with the 1940s, the war, the Blitz spirit. It comes up as a meme and a metaphor again and again and again. And you can imagine why. It was a proud moment in our history, and defeating Nazism was probably a high point, but it is always backwards looking. And the whole Brexit debacle is about an obsession with the past and a concept of Britain that is gone. And it avoids us facing the absolutely desperate problems we face in terms of what we're going to do about the ecology, what we're going to do about social breakdown and economic collapse.
I agree. And it's also a distorted view of the past. It doesn't take into account the atrocities. It doesn't take into account slavery. It doesn't take into account how various countries and nations and people across the world were debauched in order to provide a more comfortable level, not for the great mass of people in the UK, but for a privileged few. And in fact, the reverse is presented to people. I mean, when I was at school, I was told all about Clive, but not in the sense that would give me an appreciation for what Clive was, a monster, but rather as some redeemer who rescued the Indians from squalor. And I'm thinking, well, hold on a second. Didn't I read somewhere else that the Indians had a civilization that predated ours by at least 3,000 years? Where did the squalor come from? Oh, it's because they're inferior. Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Come on. I imagine textbooks are still full of that nonsense. I hope not. So it's like looking through a glass darkly, it seems to me. It's not even looking past is one thing, and you would want to value your background and culture. But at the same time, if that is a distorted image. It doesn't do you any good, it seems to me. It gets in the way of moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I also think, I think it's interesting what we're witnessing at the moment, that the British state's attempt to suppress or repress change. So, as you mentioned earlier, yesterday saying to Northern Ireland, now is not the time for a border poll, and the suppression of the right of Scottish people to have a referendum, it doesn't actually work. This repression of change, this tightening down, this saying we're not going to allow democracy to flourish, we're not going to allow votes to happen, it doesn't actually work. And you can see that by the election of Michelle O'Neill as the First Minister in Stormont. Change is happening. Northern Ireland and Ireland have gone through dramatic cultural and social change in the last 20 years that have completely changed the landscape there and allowed for people in the north who would previously not consider it to consider voting for unification. And if that happens, which is looking more likely now, if that happens, it will dramatically change some of the dynamics within the British state and the British Isles. And I think we need to remember that we are not Scotland alone fighting a binary battle for our independence. There are a number of players at play here, and they do interact with each other. Yeah, I think so. So I suppose my thesis is that the British state's attempt to make sure nothing changes and nobody's allowed to vote doesn't actually work, because change is happening underneath.
Yeah, it doesn't work in the short term because it gives you, a breathing space, but you have to use the breathing space, and that's the problem. Nobody's using the breathing space. I think that's the talking about Northern Ireland. Isn't Sinn Féin in a particularly advantageous position, leaving aside all the connections to Europe and the different arrangements that we worked out there for the benefit of the province, in that they do not send MPs to Westminster. So they are not compromised. They are not, in the eyes of some people, compromised, because they don't have to worry about, nobody has to make speeches on the floor. Nobody has to participate in Westminster because they're saying it's not relevant. We don't intend to be a part of this.
Yeah, historically, Sinn Féin have never sent MPs, and I suppose it is a strategy. It's historically what they've done. I suppose the difference with the SNP is that Sinn Féin did evolve out of a Republican insurgency movement, which is quite different from the SNP's history. So again, I think they would argue that sending MPs give Westminster legitimacy, which they do not want to do. But these two political parties come from very different political backgrounds and socioeconomic cultures. And Ireland has a much more radical tradition, even though it is a conservative country in some ways. We don't have that tradition in Scotland. That is not where the SNP comes from. And so I would just repeat, asking them to be something they are not probably isn't going to work.
I agree with that. I think sometimes you can learn from what other people are doing without necessarily embracing it. I think there are opportunities to modify an approach, and perhaps, as you say, Mike, because it seems to me this is hugely important, to actually not just produce a strategy for the SNP at Westminster, but to make it very clear to everybody what that role is and what its endpoint will be, and as well as how it's going to change over time. And I think all of these things are terribly important. I think there was a time when we could put the Constitution to one side and say, well, that's very nice to have and we'll deal with it at some stage. I think now we're getting to beyond constitutional niceties, and people need it spelled out. And I think that's maybe the change and I think the Northern Ireland developments will accelerate that sense of, please let us know what are the next steps.
Yeah, agreed.
That'll be very interesting. We're almost out of time, Mike. Are there any points you would like to make before we close?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. A lot of us in the independence movement spend a lot of time criticising the media, quite rightly, because we aren't represented. It is bias. And I would just urge people to support independent thinking, pro-independence media. So turn that negative into a positive.
Yes.
And support Independence Live, TNT, ourselves at Bella. And that is the way to amplify our voice, to network, and to build our movement. So I would put out a plea.
Well, that's a very important plea. And it's also worth adding some colour to that, in the sense that the head of Reach newspapers has told his staff, which includes people who work for the Daily Record and the Express, that they're in an existential situation, and he can't see them existing any more than 5 to 7 years in the future. Mm-hmm. So since these newspapers are going to disappear anyway, that's an additional reason for making sure that Bella Caledonia and the other outlets that Mike has mentioned are part of your media mix. And support Bella Caledonia, because as you can see by the evidence of this show, there's a lot of hard work and strong intellectual capacity there, which needs to be endorsed and supported. And the independence movement will be well advised to provide that support and not give it to people who denigrate and deny. Far better to be positive, in my humble opinion, than to crib and complain about other entities. We have our own here. Make use of it. Very important. Mike, thanks very much. I appreciate all your time and trouble.
Thanks very much. Good to speak to you.
Thanks for listening, everybody. If you've enjoyed this episode and maybe even found something useful to share in your next conversation with an undecided voter, please give us a like, and please also subscribe. It's free. New episodes out every Friday. Catch you later. Bye now.